Tick tock, tick tock, tick tock. Welcome back to Nothing and Everything, a episode where we are just talking about season 1 of Watchmen on HBO. For those of you who don't get the tick tock in the beginning, this is a full spoiler review chat about all of season 1 and all of what I think and where I think a potential season 2 might go. So, like I said, full spoilers ahead. This episode of Nothing and Everything is just going to be me, Russ. So, for those of you who have not seen it or did not know, Watchmen has been adapted or sequeled into an HBO show that fills the same spot as Game of Thrones did. And unlike Game of Thrones, that ended horribly, I believe Watchmen Season 1 ended on an incredible note. It somehow tied together most every loose string, except for Lube Man. We'll get to Lube Man later. I think it tied together most every string that people who've been watching the show have wanted. So we'll start at the beginning and work our way through. So episode 1 opens in 1921 with the Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre that did happen in American history. And it shows what white supremacists, like the Klan, did to the people in Tulsa. And that's kind of where the show takes us. And it really opens quite aggressively, but it's good. And it puts us in the zone for, oh, this is what this show is going to be about. And I think that's important. And we meet the character of Will Reeves as a young child. And Will Reeves becomes a main player in the show. Not till a little bit later do we realize how important he really is, but he is important. After the Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre sequence, we then go to Tulsa, Oklahoma in 2019, where we see a police officer in a mask pull over a person who is driving a car who has a Rorschach mask. And this is our first Easter egg or tie-in to the overall Watchmen story from 1985 and any of the other supplemental materials that we've gotten. In this version of the United States, post-Giant Squid and post-Watchmen, we have these officers who have to have their faces covered, and we'll learn why later, and their weapons are locked unless they get the go-ahead to unholster them. However, this officer was right about feeling as if he was in danger and trying to get the weapon undone, and because he wasn't fast enough on his call in and they didn't release his weapon fast enough, he was shot and wasn't killed, but shot by a member of a white supremacist group called the 7th Cavalry, who wears Rorschach's mask. For those of you who haven't read Watchmen from 1985, Rorschach was one of the main characters who was investigating the death of another Watchman named the Comedian. And Rorschach had a mask that, it gets explained in the comics, but it's like a Rorschach test. It's the symmetrical ink blots that, if shown to people, are supposed to trigger certain imagery, and it helps with like psychological testing. So this white supremacist group has taken Rorschach's journal, which is essentially the story of Watchmen, and they've warped it into this white supremacist narrative, and it is really interesting, and so it's a good backdrop for the show. Then we later meet Angela Abar, who has a front of running a bakery, but actually she's a vigilante named Sister Night. And she's, in many ways, the main character of the show and the most important character of the show. But she also is a cop who used to live in the state of Vietnam because Dr. Manhattan helped the United States win the Vietnam War. Thus, Vietnam in this alternate version of 2019 is a state. Angela used to live there. She moved to the United States because she actually met Dr. Manhattan in Vietnam and they decided that the best place for them to lay low and for Dr. Manhattan to live a normal-ish life with Angela was to move to Tulsa, where Angela's family was originally from. When she became a cop in Tulsa, she then was just patrolling all of that, and then something called the White Night happened, which was orchestrated by the 7th Cavalry and the police chief in Oklahoma named Judd Crawford, as well as Senator Joe Keene, who people may know from the comics with his dad, who is Senator Keene, who made the Keene Act, which made superheroes illegal, or masks were outlawed, which is what sets the stage for the book, rather, and then the Zack Snyder movie, which is a fairly accurate adaptation, minus the big squid, which we'll get into. So in Tulsa, she was a cop, Angela, and because of the White Night, this essentially a mass cop killing event orchestrated by inside people on the police force. A lot of cops were killed. Angela was not. She was saved by her husband, Cal, who's actually Dr. Manhattan, but he's undercover. And she then, after that, takes on this identity of Sister Night to protect herself. So quote, the bad guys won't know who she is and where she lives. However, since the 7th Cavalry is in on this with the police force, they do know where she lives. And they're just kind of making people feel comfortable and having people kind of let their guard down. And Joe Keene, who's sort of in charge of all of this, his idea is, let's have the bad guys wear Rorschach masks and the good guys, the cops, wear masks. And if everyone is wearing masks, how can we really tell who's the good guy and bad guy, in theory? Which is a really interesting way to look at how to set up conflict for the show. And based on this, we know that Joe Keene is a white supremacist. And we also learn Joe Keene, since he is this white supremacist, he has this whole thing where he's like, it's really hard to be a white man in America right now. And because of this racism that he's spewing, he has this idea that, okay, maybe running for president isn't big enough for Joe Keene. He has this plot with the 7th Cavalry to essentially trap Dr. Manhattan, who is kind of a god-type character, and to basically absorb the powers of him and become him, which is completely crazy, but in the show it works. And this is what the 7th Cavalry and Joe Keene's plan is. And we see this kind of unraveling through the show. So that's what Joe Keene is up to. Then we go back and we're going to talk about Will Reeves. Will Reeves is Angela Abar's grandfather and actually is Hooded Justice from the Minutemen, who you may know from the comics, who were the original crime-fighting team. And Hooded Justice was kind of very good at hiding his identity because he was actually an African-American individual who put on whiteface under his mask, so people thought that Hooded Justice was a white person. So he had like a double secret identity, I guess, if that makes sense. And Will Reeves has partnered up with Dr. Manhattan and a character called Lady True to try to prevent the 7th Cavalry from getting the powers of Dr. Manhattan and having basically a racist Dr. Manhattan who could basically do anything and have anyone who isn't someone he likes die. You can vaporize them instantly. So that's a big issue that we're facing in the show. Next, we're going to go to Ozymandias Adrian Veidt, who at the beginning we think is like in paradise or maybe in Ireland or England and has all these clones, and he's obsessed with recreating the Dr. Manhattan story. But throughout the show we learn that he's actually on a moon of Jupiter called Europa, which is a real moon of Jupiter, and he was put there by Dr. Manhattan in kind of like a fishbowl of this like environment that Dr. Manhattan created there, because Dr. Manhattan, of course, said, I want to leave Earth and make my own life somewhere else. And he did, on Europa. And Ozymandias is living there in kind of like a habitat. And we learn that every episode we see him, a year has passed. So his timeline in there is not the same timeline as the rest of the show. And actually, Dr. Manhattan, through the entirety of the narrative of the TV show in Tulsa, has been basically like frozen in carbonite or frozen in like this gold statue in Lady True's office, who is actually his daughter, And Lady True's mother impregnated herself with a sperm sample from Ozymandias, thus making Lady True, who in many ways is the ultimate villain of the show, and we don't really realize till the end that, oh my god, she is the bad guy. She's the one who's been orchestrating this, and it's been under our noses the entire time. And I feel like this show is going to be a really good one to go back and watch and see all the Easter eggs that have been placed through all the way. So, Lady True's plan is also to absorb the powers of Dr. Manhattan, but try to be more of a benevolent leader. But as Ozymandias says, she's just a sociopath and a narcissist, and it takes one to know one, and we need to stop her as well. And they do. But it's really interesting that all of these stories are intertwining on the idea of becoming Dr. Manhattan, defeating Dr. Manhattan, or being in love with Dr. Manhattan if it's Angela Abar. And this probably leads us to the biggest piece of the show, Dr. Manhattan, who we kind of don't really see in any real way until the second to last episode, where we have his entire backstory episode, which is probably, up until that point, episode 8 was the best episode. I think episode 9, the season finale, was the best for a bunch of reasons that I'll get into in a moment. But episode 8 does give us the same effect that the chapter in the book gave us of Dr. Manhattan being able to see time all at once. And he doesn't see time the way we do linearly. He sees it cyclically, where he can say, oh, I'm currently experiencing this exact moment at this exact time, because he can see his own timeline at any point. And it's really interesting. And the show, through incredibly good editing, makes you feel that as well. And it jumps back and forth. So it's a little hard to describe the narrative of that episode, but is very, very well done in the mind of Dr. Manhattan. And we then learn about what he's been up to, why he made life on Europa, and a bit of his backstory, and why and how he fell in love with Angela, and why the 7th Cavalry wants to become him. And then we learn that Dr. Manhattan can actually pass on his powers or pieces of his powers to other people if they consume something that he imbues with his essence, which is an egg, which is a huge motif throughout the entire show, is eggs. Just like clocks were a big motif in the original Watchmen book, eggs are really big here. And this leads us to the big thing on episode 8 is it the chicken or the egg? Because there's a moment where Dr. Manhattan says to Angela, what do you want me to tell your grandfather when I'm speaking to him? And through editing, we see the scenes happening simultaneously. And Angela asks Dr. Manhattan, how did you know Judd Crawford was a bad guy? How did you know all of this? Which prompts Dr. Manhattan to, in the past, ask her grandfather about this, which essentially puts in motion the events of the show. So in essence, Angela is actually the one who caused all the problems in the show completely by accident, by using Dr. Manhattan's powers and ability to see time, and it backfires on her. And then she has this, oh my god, moment where she says, I've created this problem, how do we do this? And then we finally see a bit of Dr. Manhattan's powers where he says, you won't be able to save me from the 7th Cavalry and Lady True and what they're trying to do to me, but you're going to try. And that's what makes me love you. And he knows that the moment he meets her, because he can see the future and the past all at the same time, which is really interesting for the show. Now, with all of that being said, where Dr. Manhattan is now captured by the 7th Cavalry, Ozymandias, we learn, has been unfrozen from carbonite, let's say. Lady True has cloned her mother as her daughter because she's crazy. Silk Spectre, whose name is Lori Blake now because she changed her name from Ubetchik to Blake because that's the comedian's last name, her father, are all in the same place watching Dr. Manhattan get involuntarily teleported into the 7th Cavalry's hideout. And he's in this cage, and racist Senator Joe Keane is like, I'm going to become Dr. Manhattan, but he doesn't realize that Lady True has the one-up on them, and as soon as he tries to do this, Lady True uses the power of this machine to transfer Dr. Manhattan's powers to actually teleport the whole room to the middle of Tulsa, where she has this millennium clock thing that we learn is able to suck up Dr. Manhattan's essence and powers and give it to her, because she's also the bad guy, the overarching villain in many ways. But she genuinely thinks she's a good guy. And for most of the show, we're like, who is she? What is she about? She's creepy and weird and very obviously a genius. But what is the ultimate plan? And we learn that. And because she has the one up on the 7th Cavalry, she essentially eliminates all of them, and Dr. Manhattan is still trapped, and she says to him, now I'm going to become you. And Dr. Manhattan knows this because he can see his own future. And she does actually kill him, kind of. She absorbs all of his essence and puts it into the Millennium Clock to give herself his power, so essentially transfer all of them to her. But Adrian Veidt, Silk Spectre, Laurie Blake, and a character named Looking Glass are at Karnak, which is Ozymandias's hideout, and they essentially use the squids again to save the day in a different way, but that's a whole other story. But they use squids to save the day and save the world, as the same as using the squid in the original book to save the world, but there are some casualties, of course. And then at the end of the episode, Angela remembers about the egg that Dr. Manhattan said, if you eat something that I imbue my powers with, maybe you can become me. And in the previous episode, Dr. Manhattan keeps talking about eggs. And he says, watch the eggs, as Angela smashes a bunch on the ground. But when she's back at her house after all is said and done, without any Cal, a.k.a. John, a.k.a. Dr. Manhattan, she sees one unbroken egg, and she eats it, and Dr. Manhattan says, it's important for you to see me walking on water. And Angela says in the past, so if I eat this egg, will I be able to walk on water? Dr. Manhattan says, in theory. And the final shot of the entire season is Angela's foot stepping onto the water, and it cuts to black, which shows how everything was tied together and everything was cyclical. It all starts where it ends, and everything like that. In general, I thought the show was fantastic. It is a little hard to talk about the show if you're listening and haven't seen it, and this is full spoilers, and I know I've missed a lot of the details about the flashbacks and what the characters' true motivations are, a lot about Ozymandias on Europa and how he's been using these clones to essentially buy his time and figure out a way to contact his daughter, Lady True, to let him back to Earth, which is really interesting. It's a really cool piece of the show that I think everyone was questioning, like, how does he tie into this? Because he's such a critical character in the first book/movie, and how is he going to be important here, besides getting name dropped and seeing these shots of him? But he is really important, and we learn how these plans that all intersect with each other kind of stem from the same thing of wanting to be God. But the only one who really doesn't ever want to be God is Angela, the main character, and Laurie, who loved John, Dr. Manhattan, back in the 70s and 80s, and she sees him again. But Angela, then, the only one who doesn't really want these powers, is the one who's able to get them, which is really cool. And I think it is an interesting way to tie it into potentially a season 2 of having her kind of be this undercover Dr. Manhattan. Or in season 2, will she basically get this sense of clairvoyance like him and detach from reality and all of that? Or will she be strong enough to control the powers of Dr. Manhattan and basically use them for good? We also haven't seen Night Owl yet, and there's a lot we still don't know between 1985 and 2019 and where the story could go now without a Lady True, but having her mother/daughter character still be alive, having Tulsa being in ruins, and having Robert Redford, the president, know about the squid attack and still keeping it under wraps. And what's the status of the world going to be if this gets out? So I think there definitely is a lot of room for a season 2 and a really interesting, maybe bigger scale season 2. And even though the first season was just in Tulsa, Oklahoma, it did get very big scale, and it was really interesting how they tied everything together and made the show about politics of now instead of the movie being about the politics of the 80s. And a lot of people didn't like it because they said the show was too woke or too blank. But the book back in the day was kind of the same thing, where it was touching on these topics, and it was very anti-superhero book and piece of literature, which in many ways was the first of its kind. And now, yeah, we have shows like The Boys and everything else, like that you have like Kick-Ass, that are like superhero things, or the movie Super, or like Chronicle, that kind of deconstruct the superhero genre. But Watchmen was sort of the first to do it, in a lot of ways the best. And this show just shows how much love can be put into something, and how you can take source material and adapt it into something modern and something powerful. And I genuinely love it, and I think everyone should watch it if you have HBO, or watch stuff on YouTube about it. If you have, you can get the month free access to HBO. I definitely recommend going through and watching this series, because it is truly incredible. It's so well written by Damon Lindelof and the others who were involved. It's incredibly well directed and shot, and it's an incredibly good show that I cannot recommend enough. And unlike Game of Thrones, the season ended fantastically and it tied together. And the one question I have is, who is Lube Man? And I know people think it's Agent Petey, who came to town with Laurie Silk Spectre as her assistant, but we didn't learn about him, which does leave a few questions unanswered on what's going to happen to the rest of the 7th Cavalry. Who is this Lube Man character? And all these other little pieces. Where's Night Owl in jail? Things like that. So I hope a second season will come soon, and I hope Damon Lindelof and the team really deliver something incredible just like this season. And if you like this, seriously, look it up. We have other episodes on See What Sticks, or not See What Sticks, that was the old name of the show. I keep saying that, but on Nothing and Everything, about Watchmen, where we talk about each episode leading up to now, and here's just an episode only about this. And the show ended tonight, which is December 15th, 2019. So I hope you all enjoy this episode, this really short piece, and I really hope everyone gets a chance to watch it or experience it in one way or another. I fully recommend it. We'll be back with another full episode later this week, but I just wanted to get this kind of review synopsis talk out of the way, because it was just killing me to talk about it. So I hope everyone has a great day, great night, whenever you're listening to this, and stay posted for more stuff from Nothing and Everything. Have a great night.